We've heard this morning that we actually at the moment have a lot of food, and yet some people still go hungry. We've heard that we need to change national priorities. How do we get started? Dan?
Well, in the first place, it's not all bad. I want people to know that, we're making great progress, and the fact that we're talking about food security now is something we wouldn't have done 20 or 30 years ago. These were low priority issues until, let's say, until 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, and they're on the agenda of the political leaders of our country, the G8, the G20. The Washington Post is having a major conference on these issues. That's a positive thing. But we do have some asteroids, what I call, that are heading towards Earth that, I don't mean them literally, that affect food production. And you're going to talk about some of these. Water resources, soil health, climate change. Those are big deals everywhere, both in the developed world and in the developing world. Nutrition and health is another thing. We're learning that what you eat actually has an impact on how long you live and how healthy you are. And science is now finding new ways to impact improving people's health by the quality of food that we eat. For years that was neglected. It was neglected in agriculture and it was neglected in the medical communities, that food was probably the most important medicine of all. That's certainly a big issue as well. And the ability of farmers to cope in this modern world of great political change, variability, these are all big issues that affect political stability and everything else. There is a difference between the developed world like the United States, where we have a much more developed sense of agriculture and logistics and governance and transportation, in the developing world, where they're moving forward, and the administration's Feed the Future initiative has helped in that regard significantly. One final thing I would say, the big gap is science. And the big gap is, it was mentioned in the last speech, is research. The level of research into agriculture, basic research, is falling. It's actually interesting to watch the research at the NIH and the National Science Foundation, which has been much more stable, than to watch the research in the agriculture world, particularly public dollars in research, which is falling. There's no way that we're going to be able to cope with these challenges in the future without having an adequately funded research budget, public research budget in the United States.
And Ricardo, what do we need to do to start switching priorities and make a more equitable system?
I guess I'd want to start that answer by saying that we do need to focus on the agricultural and food subjects that so far have dominated the discussion. In a way, I think they all are a red herring when we want to talk about food insecurity around the world. And I'll just make the point very briefly. I think the fundamental thing to fix, if we really want to address that, is democracy, because the hunger issue reflects deep-seated inequality. So if we had actual democracy throughout the world, where the actual interests of communities and the population as a whole, gender issues, rural communities, and so on, were fairly represented, many of the problems that we're about to try to get into wouldn't be as acute as they actually are at the moment. So having made that point, and we do need to get into the food and agricultural aspects, and of course, I agree with everything that Dan has said, and actually I thought after Kathleen set the table that we all could just go home, because she basically
She's got a tendency to do that
for us.
To get us all straightened up.
But some things that we could do dramatically differently, I think really are fundamental. This is about food. We need to rethink food. You know, what we're producing, what we're investing in. It goes to the point about health that Dan just made. What we eat affects our health, our productivity, our long-term well-being. And to the extent that the public is investing in that, then we need to invest in such a way that produces general public well-being. We also need to change the way in which we produce. So the productivity issue has been pointed out both in the National Geographic video as well as by every preceding speaker, is not the limiting factor. So we'll just set that aside. And speaking as an agronomist, I can tell you that...
We're going to switch your mic here.
Oh, okay. Okay, very good. Is this working now? So speaking as an agronomist, I can address the productivity issue very directly by saying that there are many ways in which we haven't really begun to tap the ecological productivity of the planet, but we have in place a model at the moment which is actually dissipative, which doesn't regenerate the resources which we need, and we know how to do much better. So we need to rethink food, we need to rethink the way in which we produce. In the prior panel, Mark and Peter went back and forth on a very important issue, which is related to the democracy point that I've made, and that is that we really need to have fair trade across the world. fair trade. At the moment, because of the power dynamics that exist, we've heard several examples already, those of us that can have whatever we desire at any time that we want, whether it's in season, whether it's local to where we are, can command the flow of those products to where we sit, just in case we may want them, which is a manifestation of great political and economic power. And it means that what we are doing is extending the footprint of our consumer economy to places where we're displacing the utilization of water, local resources such as energy, nutrients, soil, and so on to sate our demands. By definition, the economically weaker parts of the world cannot compete against that mighty power that we have. So we should not dissemble about the fact that when we talk about the hungry, we have a role to play, but it isn't the one that many of us go to immediately.
And what is the role to play?
We need to get out of the way of local and regional communities, and to the extent that we can support them to meet their own needs first, that then they can begin to build up their economies the way in which developed economies did so. We need to actually provide markets rather than undermine markets.
And that kind of goes along with the shift at USAID over time to exporting not food but knowledge.
Well, first of all, USAID has made a great effort in the Feeding the Future initiative to try to develop local agriculture economies, build women in agriculture systems, improve infrastructure, governance. There are a lot of issues. But I don't want to leave the impression that the United States is a particularly exploitive force when it comes to food in the developing world. I think our friends perhaps in China are perhaps more of the exploitive force than we are. Our efforts have been geared in two areas. One is to feed people when they are hungry. And the United States provides almost 50% of the food to the hungry in famines, in all sorts of other moral and humanitarian crises. That's been an extraordinarily important thing that we have done that has been positive for us politically, but the right thing to do. And the second thing we've done, the African Growth and Opportunity Act and other congressional efforts have been to try to develop these local economies, to build their agricultural systems so they can be economic forces in the world. And I agree with you that more of this needs to be done, but I don't think we should lay out the impression that at least in recent years we've been negative forces. I think that in large part both our private and public sector, and particularly our foundation community that used to be a part of very much, are really leading the effort to try to dramatically change the ability of people around the world to feed themselves. As Gates Foundation is perhaps the classic example, but Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, Kellogg Foundation, a lot of them are doing this work.
Should it be the U.S. mission to try to help feed the world or help the world feed itself?
Well, let's see. I'll take this first. One, it's because I ordinarily try to do that anyway, so I'll do it. But because I'm not a PhD, so I'm going to let the PhD answer the question after me. One is that it's part of our character to try to make the world better. It's just endemic in the American system. So when there are people struggling and hungry and hurting, it's the U.S. that's usually the vanguard of leading these efforts, and we need to maintain those efforts, both in terms of our food assistance programs and our foreign assistance programs generally. Only 1% of our budget in America, 1%, goes to foreign assistance. When you ask people out in the countryside, they say, how much are we spending to help countries around the world? People will say 40%, 30%, 20%, 10%. It's less than 1%. And much less than that even goes for economic assistance for agriculture. But the assistance needs to be geared to helping these people build their own systems and to help them get out of poverty, because poverty is the root cause of hunger in the world. So yes, I think it's a big part of the United States effort. It also helps our national security. 1/3 of the UN General Assembly countries are in Africa. It's a big political help for us if these people are economically strong and can sustain themselves as well.
Ricardo, and a lot of unrest around the world is food-related.
Yeah.
Right. I think that Dan has put his finger on something very important, which is the framing that's involved here, and particularly with the way that you introduced the topic in terms of the American character and intent. Let me give you an analogy to this, because it also has come up most recently in the prior panel. Suppose that you were coaching a football team, and you had somebody that every time that they got the ball, they fumbled the ball away. And you wouldn't trust this athlete very long, even though the individual had the very best of intents. So there's a matter of competence and a matter of actual results. So here's the reality about the world. Respecting
the American intent and character. You can be the best possible person that for all the right reasons still does the wrong thing. And one of the ways in which that's possible is that the rest of the world is not the same as the United States on many dimensions. So much of what has succeeded in the United States is the wrong model to export elsewhere and expect to work in the same way that it has worked here. Think of the vast resources that this nation has in terms of homogeneous, relatively homogeneous arable land throughout its entire heartland. Almost perfect weather to grow summer annual crops in that region. And then 150 years of investment that begin with the point that Mary made, where Lincoln established the Department of Agriculture, the land-grant agricultural system, the National Academy of Sciences, so that the public has invested in creating the knowledge, the research, the science base, and then we directly support the enterprise, and then utilizing various tools, including the US Diplomatic Corps, we create markets and protect markets for what we're producing in a highly subsidized way. That is, not uniformly, but it does lead to anti-competitive behaviors, which are harmful to people that are trying to provide for themselves elsewhere on the planet. So while I agree with the intent, we all know that we actually need to adapt what we're doing to the places in the world where we're doing the work, and that must begin with what the local needs are, the local knowledge, the local assets, rather than assuming that a magnanimous source of support elsewhere can take care of the entire planet, from point A, assuming that point B just needs to become the same way that point A is. And so that's just I think a very important framing thing. Now, if I may, one last thing. I don't want to hog the space, but one last thing that I think fits into this framing thing. I really applaud an adjustment that you made to the frame of this conference, going from how to feed the 9 billion to how the planet can feed itself, because the entire productive resources of the planet need to be engaged to do this. But this notion that we need to specialize so that those that are really, really good at overproducing then magnanimously take care of those who really ought to be doing something else is not going to address the issue that you have to do what you can with what you have where you are. That's fundamental.
Let's go to the question desk, and Allison.
Hi, so this is 2 questions from the audience. The first one is, can you talk a little bit, maybe both of you, about the specific types of basic research that are needed in agriculture? What are the open questions and where the effort's best put?
Water resistant, drought resistant, weather resistant crops, pest resistance in cropping, and both pests relating to plants and animals. How plants and animals can cope with weather stress and weather changes, and with radically volatile precipitation and heat, cold issues. This is an area that we're going to see all over the world. It's going to affect us in the United States, much more in the developing world, but it's going to affect us as well. That's a big thing here. 2 is slightly a variation on the theme, human capacity. We need to be training more agro-scientists, agronomists in all parts of the world. The U.S. Did a lot to train Brazil by Brazilian sciences. And now Brazil is an economic powerhouse in agriculture as great or greater than the United States. We've lost that edge in the world. And we need to not only regain it for ourselves, but we need to help the training of human capacity worldwide to address all these challenges, from traditional agriculture, from science-based agriculture, conservation-based agriculture, and nutrition-based agriculture. And right now, that talent there's just not a total void in the talent, but we need to vastly expand the talent that's out there.
And I'll gild that lily by giving a name to that, and it's already been mentioned here. There is a way to practice agriculture that does not dissipate resources, but actually regenerates resources, and which makes 3-dimensional space much more productive than we are currently doing with monocrop systems. And it links the animals and the plants that you've mentioned. It understands the way in which ecology provides niches for a multiple series of organisms, including in the soil and in the atmosphere, that affect the native productivity of a total agricultural system. The new agro-scientists that you've appealed for, which I agree with completely and would include farmers as part of the educational target, actually need to be managers of that complexity, rather than managers of the capital-intensive system, which we've linearized to depend on external inputs to create products that move from the farm and are part of the reason why we dissipate productive local resources. So this is not an option. Whether we eventually do this because we have no choice or we prepare in advance of disasters and produce in a way that we actually build the natural resources of the planet is going to happen. You know, the question is how smart are we in terms of preparing for that?
Dan's going to add one thing, and then we'll go back to Allison.
Okay. So this monocultural agriculture has been brought up many times. In the United States, it's true, we have vast segments of the country that produce either wheat or corn or cotton or rice or soybeans. Then we have other sections of the country that produce specialty crops, fruits and vegetables. And both did their best to keep the other party out of their playground or their sandbox over the years, and that was because of economics of farm programs. But that's changing rapidly before our eyes. The new Farm Bill allows much more flexibility in planting, and it allows, although it's slow to come about, insurance programs to help people move into new areas so that a wheat farmer in Kansas can grow peaches or pecans or other stone fruit, and we're going to see a lot more fruits and vegetables grown in this country because the pure monoculture agriculture is not only not necessarily good for the environment, it's also not good for the economics of agriculture as well.
Can I jump on that? Actually, there's just another question here quick about, can you sort of talk a little bit about the grain reserves, either at a national or community level?
Well, you know, the first Secretary of Agriculture, I think, was Joseph, and if you and he was very well known for establishing the 7-year grain reserves. And I often would say the first Secretary of Agriculture was Jewish, and at that time I was the last Secretary of Agriculture was Jewish. And you can ask Tom Vilsack how he feels about all that stuff. But you know, grain reserves, by and large, don't work very well. Farmers, I noticed, for example, we've had this huge corn and wheat and soybean production in this country caused by very high prices. And then prices have really tanked in the last few months, basically 6 months to a year. And I notice a lot of farmers are doing on-farm storage rather than the government engaged in storage efforts. And I think by and large what we found is that massive government-run grain reserves and grain storages are a depressant on the market and don't work very well. It may be different in the developing world where you may need those supplies because they don't have logistics, transportation, roads, refrigeration, ways to move the crop very fast. But even there, big reserves on farm or even government run just don't seem to work very well.
One more from me. There's been, someone in the audience is asking, can you comment a little bit about loss of farmland to development and the implications for solving this? What can be done to protect farmland here and abroad?
Well, there needs to be a commitment to the fact that that is important. And so there are any number of ways to deal with this, but it differs whether you're in a wealthy country or where you're in a country where self-provisioning is an important mode of subsistence. And what is happening, as has already been addressed in one panel, is that we are quite adept at appropriating resources when we have the economic power to do that. And of course, national laws should be set up to prevent that and to allow for the sovereignty that Peter was talking about. And these often are actually contravened by regional or global trade agreements that prioritize the interest of a different population. And so it basically takes the commitment of national regimes to say, you know, what is important first is the security of our population, and then we will talk about what comes after that.
And Dan,
that is a very difficult thing to arrange.
well,
But here and abroad, maybe it's
First of all, in this country, the loss of prime farmland, particularly in exurban and suburban areas, has largely been an economic factor. Farmers make more money selling their land than growing crops on their land. And how do we deal with that? Well, you do your best to give counties and states and local units of government authority, whether to set up land trusts or other kinds of conservation efforts. That just has to become a bigger ethic, particularly with people who are not involved in agriculture. That's why this debate is so important, because the production of food and fiber and food production generally is, Napoleon once said, war is too important to be left to the generals. And in this case, what we're talking about today is too important just to be left to farmers alone, although they're the very important part of it. So it has to be something to discuss in a much more national feature. We do have reserve programs, this conservation reserve program, which has about 25 million acres under reserve, which is highly erodible land. But it doesn't deal with the problem that you really talked about, is how to protect farmland in and around population areas where if you're not careful, real estate developers will gobble that land up.
We're running out of time, but we might as well go for, I see also on Twitter, this is a question about GMO labeling. Where do you stand on that?
Well, a principle of transparency should apply. What each of us will think about what GMOs are actually doing or what hazards they represent will vary. There's all kinds of research that shows that there's tremendous diversity in terms of what people understand about what GMOs are and why they are concerned about them. But it's a plain fact that there is a concern about it, and so transparency about it should exist. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, Kathleen and I wrote this piece, about a year ago, saying, you know, if you want to know if your food is non-GMO, there's an easy way to do it. Buy organic. It's non-GMO. And also food processors have the ability to voluntarily label their food non-GMO if they want to. My problem with mandatorily labeling GMO is that GMO means a million different things to different people, and you're a scientist and agronomist, so a GMO may be splicing, let's say, a gene from one species of corn into another species of wheat, or it may be splicing from a totally different species in there, or it could mean a whole variety of bioengineering issues. And so, you know, I mean, I like transparency. I think people ought to know what they're getting, but I got to make sure that it's being done sensibly and it makes sense. And we're not just subscribing to an ideological view on labeling without having some reason to do it. I mean, we don't label on everything. For example, on fair trade or labor issues, we don't label on that, although we give people the ability to label if they want to do it as well. Now, my prediction is more and more food manufacturers and processors will, in fact, label. They're going to find it, many consumers are going to demand it. When I was at USDA, Kathleen led the effort to do the organic food rules. And that has had a lot to do with the changing views of people in terms of GMOs and what they want and what they don't want. But I would be really cautious to mandatorily label something unless we know for sure what that label means. And there I'm just not positive yet.
Yeah. Well, I'll just add 2 points to that. So one is that you're absolutely right around the diversity of perspectives about what they mean. One thing that is incontrovertible is that in this nation, I'm assuming the question applied to the United States, in this nation, one thing that is clear when you have GMO production is that you have very large-scale production of monocrops that carry with them many of the environmental impacts that we've talked about right now. So we can lose sight of that sometimes by talking about the potential health effects that some people worry about. But as a marker for the fact that that's the type of agriculture that you're supporting when you buy GMO in the United States, that's a useful thing that some people may want to know. And one additional factor is that the labeling issue is not as complicated as it is sometimes made out to be. The very same companies that we are asking to label in the United States are companies that do this in Europe of necessity for exactly the same food products, and the world hasn't come to an end.
Yeah, look, I agree that GMO labeling doesn't mean a skull and crossbones. I think most Americans, for example, would make those decisions based on price and quality and taste. I will have to tell you, I think some folks, not everybody, but some folks active in the GMO labeling issue are against GMOs, and they want to do what they can that's possible to stop the production of crops using genetic engineering and new science and new technology. This has a big spin-off effect. For example, we see about 1 billion people in South Asia that have various forms of night blindness and vitamin A deficiency. And, we have ways of adding vitamin A genetically engineered into rice that probably could prevent that kind of blindness from occurring. It's been very difficult to get into the marketplace because of the anti-GMO feelings in many parts of the world. I've often suggested that the companies who are developing genetic engineering would do things like, if you eat this peach, you will grow hair. That would take away almost all the male opposition to GMOs. It's maybe Ricardo and me. But I mean by that is To date, the GMO attributes have not had a huge amount of what I call consumer attributes to them. They've been more farmer or agriculture attributes, and some of those are actually quite important if they reduce the use of water and pest resistance and everything else. A long answer to say that my guess is that more and more companies will label on their own, notwithstanding of how legislation moves.